It is the year 2020. We face a pandemic, a sensationalist media that many no longer trust, enforced curfews, police abusing their power, America embroiled in a civil war while the United Kingdom is ruled by a fascist dictator. Yes, we are talking about V for Vendetta. You know, because it's set in 2020 and definitely for no other reason. Anne here, and this is More Than a Love Interest, the show where we talk about the arcs of female characters in film. Today's topic is Evie Hammond in V for Vendetta.
I'm Evie.
Evie? Evie.
This has been one of my favorite movies for over a decade, but not for the same reason that V was sort of co-opted by certain internet groups. No, it's been one of my favorites because of how absolutely essential femininity is seen as being for changing the world. So let's talk about the women in V for Vendetta. When we see V's first terrorist act in the film, he dedicates it to Madame Justice, who he says has been replaced by an imposter, and his stated goal is to return her to her rightful place. Abstract concepts being personified as female is nothing new, but this is a pretty essential part of his character and sets him apart from the other male characters. V is shaped by the women in his life, who, in the film, have the role of building the plot for the audience. There are 3 narrators in this movie, and all are female. Evie is our narrator for the opening and closing, indicating that the entirety of the movie is being told through her lens.
It is a man. A man that made me remember the 5th of November. A man that I will never forget.
Valerie explains her own experiences, informing the viewer of how the country fell into fascism.
How unfamiliar words like collateral and rendition became frightening.
And Dr. Stanton tells us all about the detention center and V's backstory through her journal.
Well, I was told us he had to monitor for rules and rights violations. It made me nervous.
V is driven to return Madame Justice to her place. He was physically created by Dr. Stanton. He gets revenge for Valerie, and his character development during the film is because of Evie. So, first, let's talk about Dr. Stanton, or Dr. Surridge, if you prefer. Her purpose was to find a cure for a deadly engineered virus, and she is as much a zealot for this as any of the other villainous characters, starting to hate the prisoners as she views them as ungrateful sacrifices for progress, lacking any humanity.
They're so weak and pathetic. They never look you in the eye. I find myself hating them.
But then V blows up the place, and she is overcome with horror at the realization of what she has done.
God, what have I done?
Specifically, what she has done to these people, because this moment of horror is before she learns what will be done with her work. After she finds that out, she tries to flee the country and is unable to do so. So she changes her name and becomes a coroner, perhaps in effort to bury her past. And that is what she does for 20 years, until V finds her.
Jesus Christ. He's there.
But their encounter is completely different from any of the others he visits for revenge. For one thing, the poison he uses on her leads to a more peaceful end than the rest of his list. The other deaths are implied to be more violent, and we cut away from those, while we see her pass away serenely on screen. For another, he kills her in her sleep and has no prepared speeches for her. Instead, he lets her confess to him and then apologize.
Is it meaningless to apologize?
Never.
I'm so sorry.
Dr. Stanton is directly responsible for making V what he is, more so than anyone else, but her incredible remorse for her actions drives her encounter with V to be compassionate instead of vengeful, both respectful of the other's humanity. So she is a far more sympathetic character than anyone else involved in this cover-up, and I think the fact that she is the only female who had a part in it is not coincidental. This also leads to the audience finding out V's backstory through Chief Inspector Finch reading her journal. Dr. Stanton is again contrasted with the other party members because she leads Finch to uncovering the truth about what happened.
He wanted us to know the story, or at least a part of it.
While everyone else actively thwarts him. So this female character guides the 2 male heroes on their journeys, while the other male characters try to stop them.
Any discussion of this document or its contents will be regarded at the very least as an act of sedition, if not a willful act of treason.
Now let's talk about Valerie, another prisoner in the detention center. Valerie is really the most important character in this film because of her effect on V and on Evie. How V reacts to reading her story is not explicitly shown, though obviously has great impact on him, and is likely what drove him to his violent escape after her death. His whole mission, as revealed to Evie, is about getting revenge for Valerie, as much as, if not more so, for himself. We do see Evie's reaction to reading about Valerie and what brought her here, and that is very affecting. It gives Evie strength to maintain her defiance, and even to go to her death, clutching Valerie's memoir as she does so. It makes Evie no longer afraid all the time, and into the person she is at the end of the movie as much as V's ruse does. Now, Valerie is, I suppose, technically fridged. A fridged woman is one whose death serves to motivate a male character. However, unlike most examples of fridging, this is not done for shock value. V does not know Valerie before, and neither do we. Her story is all a flashback, the point of which is to remind us all of the humanity.
I know there's no way I can convince you this is not one of their tricks, but I don't care. I am me.
The hopes and dreams.
I'd always known what I wanted to do with my life, and in 2015 I starred in my first film.
Just the subject in room 6 of the detention center. The purpose of her character is not to drive V to act because of her fragile femininity being ravaged by a masculine villain, but rather to put a human face on the horrors that occur under a government bent on control instead of service.
It wasn't long till they came for me.
Importantly, she also provides a crucial solidarity to our main characters, on-screen for Evie and off-screen for V. She makes Evie feel like she isn't alone, even though she is so isolated. And that is a potent sentiment under a government whose power rests in driving people apart.
An inch. We must never let them take it from us.
Evie rushes to read the tiny paper whenever she is left in her cell, and it gives her strength to know that she is not the first to go through this. Everything has been taken from her but the last inch of her humanity, and Valerie helps her hold on to it.
I love you. With all my heart.
We will go into greater depth with Evie in a moment, but I just want to point out how much this movie frames femininity and feminine traits like compassion as positives, while masculinity is generally a negative. The highest-ranking officials in the corrupt government are all men who take few actions besides violence and oppression. The more sympathetic male characters have fewer distinct masculine traits. Finch is immediately willing to consider V's humanity instead of writing him off as just a threat to be destroyed.
He's a terrorist. You can't expect him to act like you or me.
Some part of him's human.
Showing a level of sympathy that is lacking in the other male party members. His drive to discover the truth is also in contrast to the rest of the party, who are dedicated to obfuscating it.
I'm sorry, Inspector, I simply cannot recall.
Dietrich is another sympathetic male character, and he is contrasted by Prothero. They are both prominent hosts on the BTN, but Prothero meets his death too narcissistic to even recognize who V is, while Dietrich meets his by trying to help Evie escape.
Quick, Evie, hide!
He deviates from the masculine in a few notable ways, such as cooking for Evie when she arrives, and the party punishes him for it.
Not so funny now, is it? Funny man.
V himself has many masculine traits, of course, but does not follow the party line in masculinity either. He also cooks for Evie, and he prefers the truth to lies.
Would you prefer a lie or the truth?
He is well-read, collects art, enjoys sentimental romance movies,
You find your own tree.
and shows compassion even to his monstrous creator.
I have another rose, and this one is for you.
The general citizens are not shown as having particularly gendered traits, though it is a little girl who is shown as participating in and directly leading to the revolution in her neighborhood. Overall, the heroic males are less hardline masculine than the villains, while the female characters are given voice by literally narrating their stories to the audience. And I find that pretty noteworthy for an adaptation of a gritty and anarchic graphic novel. Now, Evie's role is, on the surface, helping V finish what he started out to do. But lest anyone complain about Evie being used as just narrative fuel for V, let's talk about her character arc. And I think it is a very important one. She starts as a passive citizen, aware that things are bad but not feeling like there is anything anyone can do about it.
I wish I believed that was possible. But every time I've seen this world change, it's always been for the worse.
And she becomes the person who pulls the trigger for the revolution, but not out of rage, like V started out, but out of compassion. So let's talk about how that change happened. As usual, we are using Maureen Murdoch's heroine's journey, and I think Evie is a good example of what this journey looks like. The first step is separating from the feminine to set out on her own. We meet Evie in her own house, taking part in the very feminine ritual of preparing for a date, doing her hair and makeup, putting on a dress. This is beautifully contrasted with V also preparing for the evening and suggests that they are both putting on costumes. Evie leaves the feminine space of her house to go out and meet V. Not intentionally, of course. Her intention was to go to an assignation with her boss. Instead, she runs into the person who will change her life irrevocably. She won't be able to go home anymore after this, so is separated from her feminine origins. Meeting new masculine allies is the second part of the journey. This obviously occurs for Evie when she meets V, and goes with him to the rooftop to watch the Old Bailey be destroyed. He is a potential ally, having saved her from the Fingerman, but she isn't exactly willing to throw in her lot with him at this point. Later, when he is in the television studio where she works, she hears what he has to say, and it must affect her. Because then, when she sees him in the hallway, she maces the police to help him. So obviously his speech, and perhaps her encounter with him the evening before, has made her start to question the state of things, and to think that change may not be the impossibility she had assumed. V deliberates before taking her with him, and he becomes her main ally for the rest of the film when he decides not to leave her there. So they both make a decision in this scene that changes their trajectories. The third step of the journey is the road of trials. This begins as soon as Evie wakes up in V's hideout. The news that she won't be allowed to leave for a year is not something she takes well.
I have to stay here for a year. Why didn't you just leave me alone?
Though they do form a sort of peace for a few weeks, finding out he's murdered people is a shock to her.
Oh God.
You're upset?
I'm upset you just said you killed Louis Prothero.
And it is a trial to be trapped there. She is still seeking a way to escape him, and has not accepted the terrifying reality that V could overthrow their government. The fourth step is the illusion of success. Evie volunteers to help V, and then promptly escapes as soon as he lets her out of the Shadow Gallery. She runs to Dietrich's house, and he harbors her. She seems to have escaped both her oppressive role in society and from V. Things are even better than back to normal for her. But of course, this is an illusion. Dietrich is inspired, likely by V and by Evie, to change his show to openly mock the Chancellor.
But you're wrong, Mr. Dietrich. The terrorist was never a serious concern.
Oh, really?
And we know from our frequent visits to the party high council meetings that this kind of thing will not be tolerated. The illusion is shattered in the fifth step, and our heroine goes to her lowest emotional point. Evie has to relive her parents' capture.
Evie, quick, hide!
The worst day of her life, as she watches Dietrich be taken away.
Quick, Evie, hide!
And then it gets worse. She is captured herself.
No!
She refuses to speak and is processed, having her hair shaved off and being left completely alone. Her worst nightmare has come true. Evie has the best example of this step that I have seen. The sixth step is the descent to the inner self, and that is so rarely accurately portrayed in movies. Evie is at her lowest point in her cell, and she feels despair and isolation. But then she gets a letter from someone else who went through this.
I know there's no way I can convince you this is not one of their tricks, but I don't care. I am me.
Who emphasizes that no one can really take everything from you. There will always be a small part of yourself that is yours. And Evie clings to that inch of her humanity. and to Valerie's, and she is ready to face whatever happens to her.
But I'd rather die behind the chemical sheds.
She has encountered her true self, the one that no torture or oppression can touch, and this gives her unshakable strength and marks the beginning of her rise.
Then you have no fear anymore. You're completely free.
Literally rising from her prison to go out into the rain in a gorgeous moment of self-actualization. She again contrasts beautifully with V, who was born in fire and hatred. Evie is born of water and compassion, exactly what is needed to maintain the revolution after the inciting spark burns itself out. The next step involves a reconnection with the feminine. Evie decides not to stay with V any longer.
I'm leaving.
This is the first time she has set up clear boundaries, and V accepts them immediately.
May I show you something before you go?
She will return to live among the rest of the citizens, back to as normal a life as she can find. She has been underground long enough, and V lets her go.
If I had one wish, I would wish to see you again, if only once, before the 5th.
It is not a severing of contact with the masculine, like her initial abduction was with the feminine, but it is a departure as she reclaims her autonomy. The 8th step is healing the split with the feminine. Unfortunately, we see little of Evie's life in between leaving V and returning for the 5th. But we do hear the story of how she ran into a coworker and was completely unrecognizable to her.
She looked at me right in the eyes. Didn't recognize me.
This is evidence that Evie is no longer wearing the mask, the costume we see her put on in the opening scene, but has embraced who she really is instead, healing the split with herself. Making peace with the masculine is the 9th step. On the eve of the 5th, Evie returns to the Shadow Gallery as she promised to do. Unlike many of their previous interactions, she takes the lead. Her boundaries are clear, and V asks for her permission to dance and to show her the train. He then gives it to her.
It will if you want it to.
What?
As a peace offering and as appreciation for her forgiveness, and because of who she is to him. The movie is framed as Evie narrating who V was to her, but this is a crucial moment for showing that the relationship is mutual, and his character arc is realized by making peace with her as much as hers is by doing the same with him.
I fell in love with you, Evie. Like I no longer believed I could.
I don't want you to die.
The movie ends with Evie in the final stage of her journey, integrating the masculine and the feminine. She accepts V's plan and all that he gives her while maintaining her own newly rediscovered personhood. When Finch finds her preparing to start the train, she calmly refuses to do as he says because V's death does not make the revolution over. He accepts this, and the two of them watch the celebration from the roof as she finishes the story. V's story, but hers as well.
But I will never forget the man and what he meant to me.
I really love Evie's arc in this movie. The role of V is certainly well remembered, but Evie is as much a protagonist as he is. And she is much more relatable. V being imprisoned until he basically gains superpowers is not something most of us can relate to. But the story is Evie's, and she starts out as an ordinary person who becomes instrumental in overthrowing a fascist government. Not because she, too, had any superpowers, but just because of her strength of character and her conviction to stand up for what is right in the face of a government desperate for her to fall in line. And that is a very inspiring story. As usual, the third part of our analysis will look at how the visuals impact the heroine's arc. To do that, we're going to need to talk about the male gaze versus the female gaze. These concepts are a bit nebulous and much debated, so I'm going to simplify them considerably. Here is a clip of a love interest presented for the male gaze.
It looks like your distributor cap's a little loose.
And here is how a love interest is presented for the female gaze.
Sensual intelligence.
Wow.
Oh my god.
What is it with chicks and horses, huh?
I like that one in particular because it really highlights how, in my experience, men tend to totally miss this visual language. For example, being completely blindsided that Arya Stark was into Gendry despite framing like this. Anyway, you may be saying, but Anne, why are we talking about love interests? This isn't a love story. But isn't it, though?
I fell in love with you, Evie.
Evie starts the story by saying that you cannot kiss an idea, while we get a close-up of a woman who is credited as Guy Fawkes' lover. So there is absolutely a love interest in this movie, and it's V. Evie is not presented as the love interest in a recognizable way. Though she is obviously the gorgeous Natalie Portman, nothing in the framing highlights how attractive she is. Even when she is dressed up at the beginning when she meets V, this is not emphasized. Nothing in the framing highlights how good she looks. This is because Evie is the protagonist. She is telling the story, she has the arc, she controls the narrative. And the fact that Evie and V are introduced simultaneously, doing the same things, is indicative of who these characters are going to be to each other. Their moments of self-actualization also happen in the same way, though are clear opposites. But part of presenting a love interest for the female gaze usually includes highlighting their similarities. V is presented as a gentleman, a sympathetic character, despite being a remorseless and methodical killer and a terrorist, but we are seeing him through Evie's eyes. We never see his face because Evie doesn't know what he looks like. We cut away from most of his violent actions because Evie is not a violent person. We see his humanity both because Evie brings it out and because that is how she sees him. In contrast, we never really see her through his eyes or through any male character's gaze. This is clear through the framing and costume choices. Her most dressed up outfit is barely featured before she puts on a coat. Her pajamas are fully covering and loose instead of an excuse to show her off. She wears a man's shirt and looks cozy instead of like a conquest. Her smock shows a lot of skin, but never in an objectifying way, even in the rain. It inspires empathy for her plight, not an invitation to enjoy her humiliation. So while Evie is in the role of V's love interest, the movie actually emphasizes how important he is to her arc. He is set up to complement her, driving her narrative completely. Archetypally, this is the central point of Beauty and the Beast narratives that are told from the Beauty's perspective. The Beast has the mythic role of the shadow, or animus, the dark side of the woman who must be confronted and accepted for self-actualization. The story, from her perspective, is how Evie became a complete person because of V leading her to accept her true self, and the cinematography reflects that by emphasizing the female gaze instead of the male one. Overall, V for Vendetta is unique in its genre for the way women are portrayed. Instead of being fuel for a man's story, they take an active role in shaping that narrative as it unfolds. The only objectification of them is done by the villains, and the audience is not invited to participate in it, but to instead be horrified by it. So, is Evie more than a love interest? Yes, definitely. This is her story, and she explains how V affected her, not so much the other way around. V himself does admit to how she has influenced him, but only in the final scene. We do not see the events of the film through his eyes, but through hers, and so she is in control of the plot. She could have just narrated V's story to us, but she is instead allowed to frame V as the most important part of her story, and that perspective is why it is one of my favorite films. 2020 has been a rough year, and I've watched this movie several times in the last few months, because it is such a relief to experience a story where the female characters matter, where genuine remorse is celebrated, where love of any kind is more powerful than hate, and where every individual has the power to stand up against injustice. It seems strange that this movie is set in such a terrible year, but I hope that it helps you understand how important our humanity is, how good intentions can turn to evil if you ignore it, how no one can take it away from you, and how effective we can be when we band together to reclaim it.
Why are you doing this?
Because he was right.
About what?
That this country needs more than a building right now. Needs hope.